Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 34 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on a market square in Shrewsbury. It is 1704, and the army has come to town, or at least a few dedicated officers, fresh from victories in war against the French, who are here to recruit as many of the local men as they can connive to sign up to serve. While they're at it, they don't mind enjoying the pleasures of the local hostelries and of the local ladies. In turn, the local ladies are also seeking to recruit for themselves a husband who will take them away to fortunes new or be corralled to stay and support them, and the offspring they plan, or in some cases have already been provided with. What follows is a classic comic satire of love and war, sex and deception, complete with singing and poetry, and a woman pretending to be a man to win the love of her man. This is George Farquhar's The Recruiting Officer, first performed at Drury Lane in 1706 during the reign of Queen Anne. It was an immediate hit and went on to become one of the most frequently performed plays of the 18th century and a staple of educational curricula and theatre programming ever since. It is also renowned for having been the first play to be performed in New York City in 1732, and also the first play to be staged in the colony of New South Wales by the convicts of the First Fleet to Australia in 1789. Famously, the story of these convicts putting on the play is the subject of Timberlake Wertenbaker's wonderful play, Our Country's Good, which was commissioned by the Royal Court Theatre to run alongside their production of The Recruiting Officer in 1988, and the plays have often been paired together by theatre programs since. I confess to a personal reason for being delighted to talk about this play with my guest today, director Matt Beresford, because for the past few weeks he has been generous enough to allow me to assist him in directing a production of The Recruiting Officer in our local theatre. In fact, as we speak, we are in the midst of our final rehearsals before the show goes up for 2 performances this coming weekend. All of which is somewhat terrifying, I have to say, made more so by the fact that this has not been a normal rehearsal process. Insanely, we decided that as an alternative way to put on theatre during the pandemic, we would rehearse, stage, build a set, and perform the show entirely in 1 week. That doesn't mean that we haven't spent weeks planning for this week, and the cast have been learning their lines on their own before we finally all came together in person. So if you detect a note of hysteria in our conversation today, you will have some idea of the reason. Matt, good morning, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today about the play, as if you needed another thing to do this week.
Good morning. No, delighted to be here, Douglas. Thank you for inviting me.
Before we dive in, I'd like to properly introduce you. Matt is a director, speaker, trainer, and leadership coach. He spent 15 years working in business before retraining as a theatre director at RADA, followed by an MA at St Mary's University of London. He's directed a series of plays on the London Fringe, including the first London revival of Rona Munro's classic prison drama Iron at the Old Red Lion. He has also directed a number of productions for the amateur stage, including a wonderful production of Wind in the Willows for the Teddington Theatre. He also continues to combine his business and theatre experience to coach teams and senior executives on communication skills and leadership, and is passionate about exploring the parallels between theatre directing and creative leadership in business. So, welcome again, Matt. And my first question, what is it about The Recruiting Officer that made you want to bring it to life in the theatre at this time?
Well, thank you, Douglas. It's a really good question. And you mentioned we're in the middle of this process. So, of course, I've asked myself that a few times this week. So I was invited by the artistic director of the local company to take on the challenge of doing a play in a week for the first production that the local company, Teddington Theatre Company, would put on as a reopening of the theatre after 18 months of the pandemic. And so there were a few discussions about what we might do, and I felt very early that given it was unlikely to be a perfect production, of course, given the time constraints. And I suppose it's worth saying not only was it in a week, it's actually within 37 hours, because the cast and me have day jobs, right?
Yeah.
So it's even tighter than that. And I thought needs to be a comedy, because I think the audience need to come along and have a laugh and really go with us when things don't go quite as planned. And then I thought, well, we're kind of restoring theatre after 18 months, and so something in the restoration period would make sense. I knew this play a little because I had, as an amateur actor many years ago, I had played Ralph Clark in Our Country's Good. So I knew the play a little. I'd read it as part of that process. So yeah, I revisited that and very quickly plumped for that.
And I think also you've said to me that it's a celebration of theatre in itself in some ways. It brings an energy and a fun and an engagement with the audience, which somehow celebrates theatre, which we've all been missing. So I think a great choice in that respect. You mentioned about restoration. As I mentioned at the top, The Recruiting Officer was written in 1704 and has been labeled a restoration comedy, despite the fact that I think it represents the tail end of the period when that style of drama flourished.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about what is meant when we describe a play as a restoration comedy? What are the main features that distinguish this style of drama?
No, I can't.
Wait a minute.
I can Google it. No, I mean I could probably bluff my way through that, but anyone who really knows about restoration drama would probably. So what on earth is he talking about?
Well, I mean, to start with, the simple terms, of course, is what do we mean by restoration? It's linked to the period after the restoration of Charles II in 1660 and leads up to roughly the turn of the century at 1700, 1710. As we say, this play written in 1704, first performed 1706, is the tail end of that period. But yeah, so what were the things that distinguished what was going on in restoration comedy?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I suppose the biggest single thing for me that jumps out is the increased role of women in theatre, and women playing much more fully rounded roles in theatre, and an expectation that women would be on stage. And whilst, of course, for many centuries still to follow, there were still connotations for actresses about what it meant to be on stage, and lots of very unhelpful things for actresses. However, they were able to be on stage, and I think we see, and you mentioned it earlier on, the breeches role as well. So women stepping into male roles, certainly male costume, which I guess, like all good theatre, had double elements of enabling women to throw off some of the restrictions, physical as well as metaphorical, and of course for part of the audience, the titillation of seeing women in breeches rather than in skirts.
Yes, and also a device, I guess, for satirizing the convention of sexual politics and relations, of course.
Yeah, which is huge in this play.
Yeah, more of which to follow, as you say. The breeches roles, where it's so called, of course, because the women characters put on men's clothing, their breeches. In fact, I read somewhere that a quarter of the plays produced on the London stage between 1660 and 1700 contained breeches roles. That's just phenomenal, isn't it?
You can imagine the producers sat there talking to the writer or actor managers and saying, right, where's the girl in breeches? That was.
Yeah, exactly.
If we don't have that, we've got a chunk of our audience disappointed.
Exactly. And also you mentioned, of course, the actresses. This was, in fact, the first time that females actually were on the stage, performed on the stage as women. Previously, these roles were always, of course, taken by boys or men. And that therefore became an age when professional actresses became famous. Most famously, of course, Charles II's mistress, Nell Gwynn, and Elizabeth Barry. And as you said, audiences were drawn to see real women on the stage, engaged also in risque behavior, I guess, as well. So there was that sort of dual edge to it.
Yeah.
I also read somewhere that restoration comedy it's about social satire, as I mentioned. So it reminded me a bit of Commedia dell'arte, which we did a podcast about not that long ago,
right,
with its stock characters and the reflection of the hierarchy of society around it. That's very much what's going on in restoration comedy. Generally, the high end of society that they're representing. But I was also interested in that it's also a sort of period of licentiousness. I mean, famously, Charles II's court is rather louche, and he himself, I think, was rather louche. And so some of these plays are relatively sexually explicit in style and language. And I also read that this was an antidote to, of course, the Puritan age that preceded it, where literally the Puritans actually disallowed theater.
Yeah.
By contrast, they come out of the blocks and with this new freedom and go a bit crazy.
Yeah, and not only, I suppose, not only disallowing theatre, but also bringing lots of restrictions and a mood of Puritanism right across our national life. And you can just feel in these plays, and in this one certainly, as you said, the licentiousness, and some of it is really filthy.
Yeah.
And you don't need to dig very, very far below the surface. He's terrific at military analogies and metaphors brought to sexual strategies, and some of it's really funny. Some of it we've obviously made some cuts to because it's not appropriate for a modern audience. But even with that, it's very funny and it's very bawdy.
Yes, it's pretty out there. It's very suggestive, and it doesn't take a lot of interpretation to get the innuendo that's going on. One of the other things I mentioned at the beginning was about the relationship with the audience, Matt. And I know that in your production, you're keen that the audience be involved in somehow. I know we've got people processing down the aisles through it, and I think you've even had an idea of picking someone out of the audience or something, and they're singing and hoping that happens.
Yeah.
I think this might have been part of Restoration drama as well. How do you see it working in this style of drama?
Yeah, that was definitely in my thinking when thinking about the play, was how do we really just celebrate the idea of theatre, of essentially my view has always been that it is, at its heart, it is actors telling a story to an audience. And I did a lot of amateur acting when I was younger, and so that is a world that I know and love, and I love working with actors. And I love the design stuff, and that's great, and the set and the lighting, and it's all bells and whistles. Really, I love actors working with an audience. And it struck me that if we're going to put a play on at the end of this pandemic as a celebration of theatres reopening, at its heart, that's what we should do. And Restoration, the acting style, is very open to the audience. It really lends itself to audience involvement. There's a lot of direct address. I think probably 4 or 5 of the characters have very short monologues when other characters have left the stage. We have a brilliant choric figure in Sergeant Kite, who's our sort of a link between the audience and the stage. And then I've taken a little bit of license to add even more huzzas in than are already in the play, when the military characters more are talking generally about beating the French in war, which, I mean, love-hate relationship with the French.
It won't take much to get an English audience to huzzah against the French, I don't think.
No, probably not.
Yeah, and you're right about that reaching out to the audience. There are lots of asides, for example, where the characters are speaking in aside to the audience. And I actually also read somewhere that the audiences in Restoration drama got so involved at times that if they didn't like the play, they became so rowdy that it would close the whole production. So,
well, let's hope that doesn't happen.
Exactly. Having talked a little bit about what Restoration comedy is, I was also interested in what's different about the recruiting officer, because it's not, as I said earlier, set in the upper classes entirely. In fact, it's not really focused, is it, on the drawing rooms of the aristocracy?
No, certainly not the aristocracy. I mean, probably the highest status role in the play is Justice Balance, but he's a local justice of the peace in what would have then have been a very small town of Shrewsbury in Western England. So it's, I guess it's middle class, upper middle class. But we have an awful lot of involvement with some of the working class characters. And of course, you were talking earlier on about stock. The stock characters in this play are really clear and named such. Justice is Justice Balance. And we have a captain called Captain Brazen, who's this great outlandish, I suppose we call him fairly camp character now. So we have these stock characters, but he gives quite a lot of stage time to people of a much lower status in society, and there's a lot of comedy in the interplay between the relative status of the different characters.
Yeah, and I think that it's also because it's set in the country as opposed to the London drawing rooms.
Mm.
It's set, as you said, in this small town of Shrewsbury. It's in the market square along the riverbank. It's set outside, so not just in the
Yeah.
stultifying drawing rooms of London. And the cast is diverse, and we see a diverse social mix. And
Mm.
that's also partly about the audiences that it was reflecting. And again like Commedia, where they saw their world reflected on the stage. And the Commedia troops, of course, were traveling town to town and putting shows on in the market square. And this play feels a bit like that, doesn't it?
Yes.
I was going to ask you, actually, going back to the beginning about George Farquhar, because I have to confess, I didn't really know who George Farquhar was until we picked up this play.
Mm.
But I gather he had quite a picaresque life, much like some of the characters in his plays. Do you know anything about George Farquhar?
No, I mean not an enormous amount. I mean, he was. I think he's Anglo-Irish and son of a clergyman. And clearly, through the recruiting officer, we see lots of the various different parts of Farquhar's life, both serving. I think he was, in fact, a recruiting officer himself
Yeah.
at some point. And so he's clearly drawing on all of these experiences and the various characters that he's met in his travels. And then I think he had a short acting career. I'm not sure he was a terrific actor before then beginning a writing career where he was much more successful. And I think he kind of, again, late Restoration, writing through the very late 17th century into the early 18th.
Well, he had quite a short writing career, in fact. As you said, he started off as an actor. He was born in Ireland. His father was a clergyman. But his father died when he was quite young. I read somewhere that he fought in the Battle of the Boyne in 1690 at age 13.
Wow, gosh.
So, an early introduction to the army and the realities of war. He then went to Trinity College in Dublin, and I'm not sure what he was studying, but he left after 2 years without a degree. There are questions about whether he was thrown out or whether he chose to leave. But what he chose to do next was to go onto the stage, as you say, as an actor in a troupe in Dublin. And there's a great tale that's worthy of a Restoration comedy itself, I think, is that he quit the acting profession because he accidentally wounded a fellow actor on stage in a fight using a real sword instead of a foil, and was so traumatized, or perhaps ostracized, that he quit. He came to London after that, and he wrote his first play in 1699, which is about an Irish gentleman of a wild roving temper newly come to London. And but it was a hit, and that meant he could be a playwright, although several plays later they were not so successful, and he was in financial straits. So there's another great story. These are great stories. I don't know how true they are, fit for the stage, this story, that he fell into a relationship with a wealthy widow, but it was only after Farquhar married her that he discovered that she actually had 3 children and was penniless. He got caught there. To his credit, he did not desert her, but what he did do was he was forced to enlist. And as you say, he became a recruiting officer, stationed even in Shrewsbury, and apparently wrote the recruiting officer while staying at the Raven Inn in Shrewsbury, which I think he mentions in the play, the Raven Inn.
He does, yes.
So that recruiting officer was a great success when it was formed in 1706, but by then he was actually pretty ill with what was probably tuberculosis, and he died only a year later after the premiere of his next play, The Beau Stratagem, which did open to acclaim. But he died quite young, like probably 40. It's not even sure what year he was born, 1767 or so, but by the age of 40. But a eventful life in those 40 years.
Well, those 2 plays as his last 2 plays, I mean, you said earlier on, the recruiting officers still performed often now on the professional and amateur stage, as is The Beau Stratagem. The number of plays we must have missed from him that would have been extraordinary. What a real shame.
I wanted to ask you about the historical context a bit before we dive into the detail of the play and what happens in the play. But by way of background, is about these recruiting officers and what they're doing. What is a recruiting officer doing at that time?
Yeah, I mean, as you said towards the beginning, essentially the line between volunteers and people who were impressed into the army was, I guess, fairly fuzzy and open to corruption. and alternative motivations. And we see that very much through this play. The desire to get Captain Plume, arguably our titular recruiting officer, although maybe we'll come on to that, his company of men so that he will leave Shrewsbury. And the sooner he gets his men, the sooner he can go. And I think, as we were talking about the other day, actually, the idea of people who've been convicted of a crime being impressed into the army was quite common.
Yeah.
So I think you got more money for volunteering, but yeah, there was every chance you could end up being tricked into the army or on trumped up charges being put into the army. And I'm from Portsmouth, so we're much more aware of press gangs, which we kind of think about much more as Navy. And of course, in the Navy, before you knew it, you were on you're drunk, and then you wake up the next morning, you're on a ship and you're halfway to Spain or France. You can't do much about it then.
Oh my God, yeah. I guess it was in there, the recruiters officers' financial interests to recruit as many as possible, right? They make their living this way.
Yeah.
So they're almost on a commission scheme, so to speak. And of course, those being recruited do get paid to join up. And we see in the play there's a certain attraction to that, particularly to the lower class people. They do overpromise the recruiting officers, of course, to lure them into the army. But the background to this as well is very specific, of course, and there's mentions, I think, even in the play, to the fact that there was the War of Spanish Succession was going on at the time that this was written, which ran from 1701 to 1714. And in fact, the Battle of Blenheim, very famously fought in 1704, so Farquhar would have been aware of that. And the recruiting officers, as we've said, are just back from the battlefield when they come to Shrewsbury. And the Battle of Blenheim was a very significant victory for the English, or the Grand Alliance. They were aligned with the Dutch and the Holy Roman Empire against the French and the Spanish. And of course, they just continued to need recruits for this ongoing wars. So the Parliament kept passing these acts to support the recruitment and enlistment to the army, to bolster the army. And these guys, Plume and Kite, which we'll come to, the characters or the recruiting officers, are out there beating the bushes to raise the men. I wondered if we could start now by giving a little bit of a summary for those who don't know the play, Matt, about what actually happens or who these main characters are. I know that it's actually quite complicated.
Yes.
We've spent quite a few hours trying to decipher what exactly is going on with some of the convolutions of the plot. But if you could try your best at some sort of summary of what happens or who these people are.
Yes, let's see how we get on. The main plot revolves around Captain Plume, arguably the recruiting officer of the title, who comes to Shrewsbury to recruit men with his loyal Sergeant Kite. He has spent time in Shrewsbury before. We know this because he is in love with Sylvia, the daughter of a local Justice of the Peace, Justice Ballant, who I mentioned earlier on. And very early in the play, I guess what really starts the play off and running is that Sylvia's brother, Owen, dies, which leaves Sylvia as Ballant's only heir. Now, Ballant had been very happy to give his blessing to a union between Sylvia and Plume. Now, Sylvia is his only heir. He no longer is. And at the same time, he receives a letter telling him that Plume has dastardly designs on Sylvia. So Ballant decides to get Sylvia out of the way and send her from Shrewsbury out further into the depths of the English countryside. And as far as Plume is concerned, that she's gone. She's left, and he's not sure why. So he continues with the recruiting. And then at some point, a couple of scenes further on, this new chap arrives, Jack Wilful, a gentleman. No one really knows much about him. And of course, it turns out to be Sylvia in disguise. And she comes back with two real purposes. One, to find out whether Plume is genuinely true to her or whether he is simply a rake. And she has good reason to think he's a rake because, you know, he's a man who enjoys drinking the ladies, as you said earlier on. And through the play, she discovers that, yes, actually, he is true to her. And then the other thing which drives the action on is when Ballant sends her into the country, he makes her promise that she will not, and the word he uses is dispose of herself to any man without his consent. And he makes her the same promise, that he won't dispose of her without her consent. And so what Sylvia realizes is that by dressing as a man, she can get her father, the local justice of the peace, to force her to be impressed into the army. And therefore, by the letter of the promise that they have made to each other, Ballant will have given her away to the man she loves, to Plume. That is the main plot. As is always the case, there are subplots of Sylvia's cousin Melinda and Captain Plume's friend Mr. Worthy, this very outlandish Captain Brazen, Melinda's maid. I think we can probably do without maybe going into all of that, but these plots intertwine. And as is the case in most good drama, Melinda operates in many ways as a strong contrast to Sylvia. She is newly rich, wearing that new wealth a little heavily in her attitudes and the way that she treats people.
Yes, because that's partly all about as you said earlier, about what is the appropriate partner in the social hierarchy. So Plume, the captain,
yes,
is not acceptable once Sylvie becomes the sole heir to the estate and all its wealth. And Melinda inherits money and decides that her previous suitor, the local gentleman Worthy, is no longer worthy of her either.
Well, yeah, that and it feels like she's almost getting him back, because for some time he was very happy with her as a mistress, and now she comes into lots of money. It feels a little bit like she wants to make him suffer a little for the fact that, well, I was only good enough for a mistress before, and now you only want me for a wife because I've got a lot of money. And then, of course, we're looking at this 300 years later with our own lens on relationships and sexual politics, whereas, of course, things were very different then, particularly because of the highly stratified nature of society then.
To go back to the stock characters, I wonder if we could just talk a little bit more about how these are stock characters. So Plume, he's the Rake, right? He's the Rake hero.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about, what you think of the character Plume. What's he like? What's he all about?
Yeah, the way that we've been talking to the actor playing Plume a lot over the course of this week, I think, is around charm. He strikes me as one of those people, and you meet people like this through life, who everything's going to just work out great for him. Things just bounce off him. He'll have an answer. It'll all be okay. It'll all work out. And the nature of the name, Plume, of course, suggests perhaps peacock or, the male bird with display. And of course, he is good looking and he is charming, and women do fall for him. And it's certainly the largest part in the play. I'm not sure his character is the one that's driving the action through. Maybe we'll come to talk about that. I think Farquhar does something very clever with the title and with the size of the role, which I guess he had to make the male roles bigger. I don't know, but probably the expectation was that the male roles would be seemingly the main parts in the play. But I think he's doing something different.
I think, the Rake is a primary stock character in Restoration drama. I think it is, it is just that lead focused character. And it's a seductive, witty, arrogant chap who's, it's a sort of flattering idea of the male prowess and sexual prowess, but which of course was much admired by the court of Charles II.
Yeah.
And so I guess Plume appears to be a bit of a rake and a philanderer. In fact, we missed a little detail in the plot, which is just a side issue really, was that he sires children around the country, it appears. When he first arrives, his sergeant advises him that, you remember this girl Molly up at the castle? Well, she's had a child and it's yours. And
yes, that's right.
Sort of reputation like that. But I thought what was interesting, Matt, isn't it, is that despite all this bravura behavior, he still remains the hero. There's some sense of some integrity somewhere in there, isn't there, with Plume?
Yeah, I think it's what you said earlier on, and maybe this is a tricky thing for us to understand in terms of the sexual mores of the time, is, well, there's two things. There's one before and after marriage, and then there is men and women and the expectations there. And then maybe there's also class, because to be frank, the women that he has been siring children with are all working class. And maybe to the audience at the time, that kind of didn't count. That siring children with Molly at the castle and Dolly Wagonbottom from Portsmouth, that kind of didn't count in terms of being promiscuous, I guess. It's a slightly tricky thing for us to get our head around, and so it's a difficult balance for the actor actually to play this character now and be loved by the audience, as he must be for the nature of the play to work. The audience have got to really like him because they spend so much time in his company.
Yeah, I think you're right there, though, that there are obviously different standards and mores that apply. But ultimately, he is the hero. And underneath this cavalier exterior, there is something of integrity. And because he has this line towards the end where he says, I am not that rake that the world imagines. I have got an air of freedom which people mistake for lewdness in me. And I think we believe him at this point.
Yeah, I think we do. Yeah.
And of course, he commits himself to Sylvia, and I think we believe that too. You talked earlier about who's driving the play. What about the wily servant, Kite? What about his name? What does his name tell us?
Yeah, I suppose his name is related to the bird, right? It's, he's above the action, looking down, spotting prey, swooping and grabbing with lots of different ways of inveigling men into the army, whether that is by getting them drunk, showing them what appear to be, to these poor peasant folk, just pictures of the Queen, which of course turn out to be guineas, amounts of money that they would never have held in their hands. So he serves a number of purposes. I think, as I said earlier on, I think he's the choric figure really for us as an audience. I think we really like him. He's a wheeler and a dealer. He's got an answer for everything. He's very quick-witted. He's sort of one step ahead. I think he's probably the second most intelligent person in the play after Sylvia. And he's ahead of what Plume, his captain, is going to do. And his drive is money, serving his captain. You can imagine him, with a big nest egg somewhere, and at some point he's gonna retire on all this money that he's made.
To his bungalow by the sea.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you're right. As the Kite, he's ruthless in his pursuit of his prey. He's, as you say, witty, cynical, clever, conniving. He's a survivor. He's always looking out for number one. But he's very funny, too. He's got a very dry wit.
Yeah.
And on the make all the time. A great character. And then you mentioned Sylvia. She is the smartest person in the play, isn't she?
I think so. Yeah, I very much think so. And it's very interesting. We were plotting out yesterday the program. Of course, when you look at the character lists in this era of comedy, the women are generally listed in relation to the men, right? So Sylvia is daughter to Balance, in love with Plume, right? That's how she's listed, which is fascinating because when you do any work on this play, even simple analysis, it's very clear that it is Sylvia that is driving the plot forward. If Owen doesn't die, there really is no major plot because Sylvia can marry Plume and everyone lives happily ever after. Because Owen dies, Sylvia faces a real dilemma, doing what she wants to do, disobeying her father. And so she decides, yes, she goes into the country. She comes back in this breeches role, dressed as Jack Wilful, this gentleman. And it's really her driving it through. And one might argue, and I think you hinted at this earlier on, that she is the recruiting officer, that it is she who is doing the recruiting of Plume and saving him from a life in the army and winning for herself the man that she loves. Even though she doesn't have the most lines and she's not on stage the most, I think it's very much her that drives the plot forward.
Well, she strikes me as one of those fantastically strong independent mind in women of Shakespeare, like Rosalind in As You Like It or Viola in Twelfth Night.
Yeah.
Of course, who similarly demonstrate their independence of mind by disguising themselves as men. But
yeah,
she has a determination and an independence of mind to pull this plan off, right? And she outplays both Plume and her father when it comes to it to get what she wants. But she's also very, I think, as we said earlier, this whole cross-dressing thing highlights very much what the differences are between men and women in this society, and that she recognizes, there's some great speeches she has, isn't there, Matt, with Melinda early on about what it means to be a man or a woman.
Very, very much. In fact, Melinda says to her at one point something along the lines of, you wish to lose an appendage to being a woman that can be more easily disposed of being a man, by which she means her virginity. And this is running through that first scene where Melinda is essentially accusing Sylvia of being the equivalent of a female rake. And Sylvia doesn't entirely deny it. She says, I'm tired of wearing a petticoat. I'm tired of
the restraints, the constraints.
Yeah, exactly, the restraints. Yeah, I'm tired of that. And so when this dilemma comes to her, obviously Farquhar has very cleverly foreshadowed it, but that's already in her thoughts, that I could come back dressed as a man. I'm as good as any man. And she says that I could do anything that a man could do. I think she says except drink. And so she absolutely puts that to the test, and she carries it off beautifully.
Yeah, exactly. Those speeches, as you say, with Melinda, she sees that the opportunities for men and women are so different to live as they desire, and that the men have the freedom to do this. And Melinda talks, for example, also about settling, I guess, for an unadventurous man to settle down and be married. And Sylvia would rather have a man of energy and curiosity and who has seen the world. And she'd like to be able to do that too, to pursue a life of adventure that she sees the men being able to do. And of course, she tries the costume on to give it a go, albeit temporarily. And ultimately, though, wouldn't you say that, as you said, when you talk about the program, that the women are generally essentially pawns in the patriarchy of the time, aren't they? They don't have a lot of agency, do they?
No, and it's difficult to know what Farquhar is necessarily saying there. Melinda, the character Melinda, this sort of contrasting character to Sylvia, who's recently come into a lot of money, she isn't all that sympathetically portrayed by Farquhar. And one can understand why she feels the way she does, as we discussed earlier on. She moves from, well, I was only good enough for a mistress, and now you want me for a wife, but really what you want is my £20,000 that I've inherited. This is a time where women's advancement is dependent on men, whether it's marriage or whether it is inherited wealth. And I don't know whether Farquhar is. It's difficult to understand Farquhar's attitude, and maybe that's the genius of the play, that we are left to make our own decisions about what we feel about these women and these characters. And I'm sure we feel very differently about these characters now than we would have done 300 years ago. It's not didactic in its approach to sexual politics. It's left relatively open. But I suppose I feel that him centering the play around Sylvia's goals and her actions is telling about the potential of women and the restrictions that are placed on women.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of the women characters are generally having to navigate the whole system, the hierarchy of society, in order to make the best they can out of it.
Yeah.
And they have to be clever and energetic to figure their way through it at whatever level. So you also have Rose and Lucy. So Lucy is Melinda's maid, and Rose is a market girl, local girl who Plume and also Jack Wilful, it turns out, hit on. And she's looking for an opportunity out too. She's looking to latch on to a captain in the army or someone who can take her away and give her some security and a future. What are the options? What are the limited options they've got?
I mean, without moving too much into the modern day, when we were rehearsing one of these scenes the other day and I was talking to the actress playing Rose, there is a slight sense of, Love Island and, meeting a celebrity and being an Instagram influencer to Rose, where, her prospects are very, very low. As you say, she's a market girl. She is likely to spend most of her life, having babies. And yet she suddenly sees this opportunity with these two gentlemen who give her the glad eye. And she feels, I could be a captain's lady and ride a horse and go to London and do all these things. And you get this sort of sense that some parts of that haven't changed all that much.
That's a great point, because when you look at those scenes with her, there's a question about how overtly do you present how she's exercising her wiles. She turns it on, right? She's seducing the men as much as they're seducing her. And it, boy, oh boy, as you say, that Love Island comparison sounds pretty apt. I don't know what it also says about the picture of marriage. I mean, marriage also, is what we've just been saying, is possibly the only option open to women for their security. And it's what was expected of them. They weren't expected or allowed any alternatives to that. What do you think the play says about marriage itself?
Well, the parallels that he draws, and you mentioned this in your introduction, between the kind of contract of marriage and the contract of of being impressed into the army. There's a lot of metaphors around sieges and campaigns, and actually even stronger language than that around sexual conquest. It almost feels to me that the play is bridging marriage as a love match, Sylvia and Plume, and marriage as something more transactional. And women, maybe more than the men, trying to navigate that. And you see that challenge. Sylvia has a very brief monologue where she is balancing up this idea of the contract with lots of money, but probably married to, she describes as an ass, or a pretty fellow, the man she loves, but much less money. And that challenge is there. And I think it's best expressed in Lucy's role, actually. And Lucy operates as a bit of a villainess through the play, ostensibly tricking another captain, Captain Brazen, this great, terrific character, outlandish, camp, enormous character, into thinking that he is going to marry Melinda, whereas actually it's Lucy that wants to trick him into marriage. And she, the sense that that is all she can do, that is the only chance she has of living the life that she might want to live. And she mentions at one point, I think Melinda is told by a fortune teller that she might die a maid, and Lucy has this great line about, what, come into the world for nothing? That is it. That is your life as a woman, to be a wife.
Yeah, one way or another, as you say, that the marriage is possibly the only economic option they have. And of course, we've talked a lot about one of the themes in the play, which is about class, that it very much depends on where you are in the pecking order as to what your options are, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess I feel that this marriage between Sylvia and Plume will probably be very happy, and that I don't think she's likely to be subservient to him.
No, that's right.
And it's a bit of a shame that Farquhar gives, I mean, I suppose understandable for the time, that Farquhar gives the final speech to Plume. I would love Sylvia to have something to say at the end.
Yes. It's a bit like, I think it's the servant of two masters. And again, reminding me of Commedia, that at the very end, the woman who's been wearing the trousers through the play also gets married. But there's some line that suggests she's going to continue to wear the trousers in the relationship.
Right. Okay.
And I think that's what we're after, really.
Yeah, I agree.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the way that there's a fair amount of innuendo and suggestion about what goes on between the men. They're kissing each other by greeting. They share beds in their accommodation. They refer to each other as pretty fellows.
Mm.
Do you think there is an underlying suggestions of homosexuality in the army in all of this, or is that overplaying it?
I think it might be overplaying it. I'm not very hot on the sort of sexual mores of the early 18th century. It strikes me, I think we might have talked about this when we were chewing the fat over the play one evening. I spent a bit of time in India on holiday 3 or 4 times, and very, very common in India for straight men to walk along the street holding hands. Extremely, extremely common. And to be, to have one arm slung over another shoulder. And a degree of kissing, I think, within parts of the Arab world is also very common. So I think it is more a male friendship. And I'm not saying there's no homoerotic element to that at all, but I think the lines are fuzzy. I don't think it's an automatic suggestion of homoeroticism. And of course, some practical things. I think, the lying with was also very common. Common for people to share beds in inns with complete strangers, partly for warmth and for money. Yeah, I personally don't read too much into this. Brazen, who is, as I said a couple of times, certainly what we would generally call the campest character in this play, no suggestion whatsoever that he's gay. He is pursued by women and certainly pursues women, whether for money or for sex, we're not entirely sure of.
I mean, he's a fop-like character. He's the soldier braggart in the stock array, isn't he?
Yeah.
And a great character.
Yes, he is.
And in fact, the flip side of this, of course, is that there's this great frisson goes on between Plume and Wilful. Plume thinking Wilful's the man, of course, when in fact it's Sylvia, the woman he loves and is sexually attracted to, and he feels this attraction to him when he's Jack Wilful. And there's that frisson is there.
Yeah, that's a great scene. It's a super scene, that, I think. But it's like Plume can't quite work out why he finds this chap so compelling. It's scrambling his brain.
It's a great scene where the audience is let into the subtext of this. The audience knows what's going on and he doesn't, and it's wonderful to watch. We talk about what goes on in the army. I mean, wondered what you thought about what the play has to say about war. We mentioned earlier that this was a fact of life. I think at the time of the play was being written, and Farquhar himself had experienced it. And the men, of course, talk about it and they celebrate their victory. And there's something macho about the fact they've been on the battlefield. But do you think there's other things being said about war?
Yeah, I do. I think there's an enormous amount being said about war through the play. And if I had one regret, even at this stage, about the challenges of putting on a play in a very truncated time like this, it's that I don't think me certainly, and that you and I through our conversations and as we've analysed the play and broken it up, have spent enough time talking about what Farquhar is saying about war and about the impressing of men into the war, the inveigling of men into the war. And this has been an area that's always fascinated me. I'm very interested in what we expect of primarily young men, now increasingly young women as well, in terms of sending them off to fight. But to answer your question, I think it runs right through the play. I think Sylvia especially, this terrific courtroom scene when she is provoking her father into impressing her, what he thinks is this man, into the army. And she has some terrific lines, about send your own sons to war, who, do nothing more than chase foxes. I think, I'm paraphrasing, but that is essentially what she's saying. And so I think there is also an element where what she is also doing is trying to stop Plume ever having to go to war again. There is a drive for her there. But I definitely think he's making a comment on how men are put into the war. But what he does, as I said earlier on, in terms of the sexual politics, he doesn't ram anything didactically down your throat. He allows the inveigling to be comic and for us to almost be complicit with how Kite is going about doing what he's doing, both when he gets a couple of peasants drunk in an early scene and when he uses a fortune teller's outfit to sort of baffle a local smith and a local butcher. We go along with it. We love it. We like it. We don't realize that these four men are probably got 6 months to live, right? They're going to be cannon fodder somewhere in France or Flanders in the next few months.
That's exactly right. It's funny, as you were talking, I just thought of how ageless this is in a way, and there's a weird coincidental connection in that the actor we have playing Plume was also a lead actor in Owen Shear's play Pink Mist, which is about boys from Bristol being sent off to Afghanistan. And as you say, we go along with Kite with his unscrupulous methods of recruitment. He's over-promising to them that they're going to have promotion and wealth, and they are basically cannon fodder. And every generation, the army needs to recruit to fill its quotas. There is also talk about how dangerous it is, as you say. Plume, in the end, when he realizes that his prospect is at home in the safety of the manor house with Sylvia, he talks about the fact that he won't lose his limbs.
Yeah, that's right.
And there's obviously, at the very beginning, Kite talks about the bed of honor. And there's a double meaning in all of that. The bed of honor has 10,000 men in it, and they never wake.
Yeah.
Obviously, in the fields of death. So, yeah, there are mixed messages going on. He talks about the brutality of the war when Kite talks to the butcher about serving as a surgeon general and cutting limbs off on the battlefield. And, you get that picture of it being a pretty gruesome prospect.
Yeah, it's not far below the surface.
However, by contrast, we've talked about some of the language in this play that's quite florid, and it's clever. There's lots of puns and wit and irony and things, and sometimes it's quite challenging. In fact, I read somewhere, and this will be music to your ears, that Restoration playwrights would sacrifice pace to allow time for displays of wit. So I know we've been talking about how we keep up the pace, and these guys just going on with their witty phrasing. What do you make of the language in the play?
Yeah, I mean that definitely is music to my ears, and I obviously done a lot of work on the text. I did a lot of cutting, and arguably may have cut more. It's always a challenge between, you can pare things back to just drive the plot as we would expect in a more modern play, and you don't want to lose some of the lovely comedy. So the fortune teller scene is the classic one where Kite, as this, sort of foreign doctor, a bit like a Dr. John Dee type character, is baffling these two local market sellers into the army. Now, you can easily lose those two scenes and probably chop 10 minutes off the play. You lose a lot of that sense that's underneath the play of the war, of the recruiting, of what Kite is doing, feels he has to do. So that is always a tricky balance. There's plenty that can go, and lots of it is just beautiful to hear as well. I mean, I do love the sound of it. I really do. I love the word ordering. So much of it is so terrific. That balance is difficult for a modern audience, I think.
It's both a challenge and a joy, isn't it, in a sense? Because it is what's part of the joy of the play, is that some of the language is just lovely, and the metaphors are wonderful. And that, occasionally a speech is stretched out because there's some sort of more general philosophizing point being made, which is, Shakespeare does it all the time. And that's part of the wonder of Shakespeare, is that we listen to the wisdom in the language as well.
I'm pretty sure I learned this years ago that we used to go to hear a play. That was the way we talked about going to a play. We used to go to hear a play. No one would ever say that now. And so one of those challenges, I think, for the modern director, modern actors, is people just don't listen as we're just not used to listening. Our eyes are much more dominant as a sense, and so there is always that tricky balance to strike between, will people really listen to this kind of language for this long?
What you're doing, though, when I watch you direct as well, is that one has to identify in the language, which may be somewhat arcane in its style or even vocabulary, as to what is the meaning and what is the intent behind what they're saying as a character.
Yeah.
And somehow embody that in the way you deliver the line, in the physicality. And this is true of Shakespeare, isn't it? When we go to watch Shakespeare, we're not getting every line as opposed to reading it.
No.
Because our ears are not attuned in the same way. But we do get, if it's clearly directed and clearly delivered, we do get the gist, we get the meaning, we get the intent. And if you can do that, you also, in passing, so to speak, pick up what the language is doing too. You will actually take it on, I think, and understand it. And that's certainly been a joy. So there are things we've said about this play that come from its period. The language, the mores of sexuality and women in men's place, the strict hierarchical societies. Does this play feel, old-fashioned, and why is it worth preserving and reviving 3 centuries after it was written, Matt? Why do we want to do this still?
Well, we've mentioned a couple of things already, haven't we? But both in terms of what we expect of young people going into the army, and maybe young people who feel they have a few other prospects. And you've got to look at adverts for the Royal Navy or the Army now and look at the way that they encourage people to join the army. And I'm not making a kind of anti-armed forces point. It's a necessary part of our society. And what they're talking about is see the world, learn a skill, right? They're not talking about potentially be involved in a war and be responsible for people's deaths. And I suppose we're going through a time after Me Too in terms of sexual politics and the relationships between men and women and the navigation of that. And this play is very much centered around that. We continue, I think, to struggle with the idea of what men and women want from one another and what isn't appropriate, and what isn't appropriate depending on what someone's class is and what someone looks like and how much money they've got. I mean, these things are universal. And we mentioned earlier on about maybe Rose is a little bit like someone whose only possible chance of ever having a decent life, the life that she sees on Instagram, is to marry someone rich. And I think there are still a lot of young people, young men and young women, who feel like their only opportunity of wealth is either working class people to either become famous through singing or playing a sport or marriage or by becoming an influencer.
Also, going back to Rose, is that whole idea of having to adopt a sort of, as in Love Island, a sort of hypersexualized identity, that it's an outdated idea of what you have to be as a woman.
Well, and what's even more interesting, I think, about Rose is that she thinks that it's in her power, right?
Yes.
She thinks she is being, I'll use my sexuality to get this guy to buy chickens from me, right? And maybe I'll catch him for me. but she does not know what she's dealing with, right? This guy really knows what he's doing, right? She is going to get hurt. Now, we don't see any of that, of course, but that again strikes me as quite like some young women today who, whether it's OnlyFans or whatever it is, think they're in control and often are not in control.
No, and in fact, Rose gets traded on pretty quickly. I mean, Plume sells her to Wilful in the play.
He essentially sells her to Wilful, yeah.
And when you were talking about sexual politics earlier and identity, I thought was interesting too, because I think there's a sense in this play, isn't there, suggesting that honesty is what it's about. Because, of course, we have all this play acting going on. Every character in some way or other is putting on airs, as Melinda and Sylvia discuss at one scene. The men are being macho soldiers, and men are not allowed to be other than the macho characters that they present to the world. And of course, the whole identity of dressing up and pretending to be a man, and what does it mean to pretend to be a man?
Yeah.
But then in the end, of course, I think Sylvia and Plume come to an honest meeting. Plume asks Sylvia, do you mean this in good earnest? Are you true? Is this the real you? And vice versa. Is this the real Plume? Is this the real man who's allowed to be sensitive enough to quit the battlefield and fall in love?
I think that's a brilliant point, especially in relation to the men. Even Worthy, who is very influenced by Plume in terms of how he should approach now courting Melinda for a wife rather than a mistress, play acting most of the time. What he really wants to do is go to Melinda and say, I'm really sorry. I wanted you for a mistress because you were here. Now you're here. I would love to marry you. It's like he won't just say that. It's like he goes along with Plume's scheme about, pretend you've slept with loads of other women or do this and do this. And he's very influenced by Plume.
Yeah, play hard to get in this whole game of sexual mating. And also everybody's playing the roles in society. I think the other thing about it, of course, in terms of its enduring attraction and relevance, is it's just also pure entertainment. It's a fantastically funny and rousing, uncomplicated in some ways, really complicated in others. But whether you get all the devices of the plot or not, it doesn't really matter. We get the gist. It's a rollicking, great play.
Yeah.
And it includes all sorts of different types of people, as we said earlier. The stock characters are always funny. But there's also an element of truth in stock characters that reflects people in the society we recognize around us. And that's still true. And of course, we're all striving to make our way in any way we can by work or marriage or schemes or whatever it is. And we're all interested in the ageless dynamics of love and marriage and mating for love or advancement, as we've been talking about. So I think it's all in there. I think as any great art, it does speak beyond its time.
Definitely the energy that comes off the play. I think you're right. It's got a feel of a farce. It just gets quicker and quicker and quicker. The scenes come thick and fast, the entrances, exits, the tempo of the dialogue. It's a beautiful piece of work. It really is. It's great.
And I know you're going to maintain the pace, Matt.
That's one of my key challenges over the next few days.
One of the things you've also said is that Farquhar doesn't really stand in judgment. He doesn't condemn the characters particularly. There's things to say about their pretensions and even some of their deceptions, but he seems to empathize with their challenges in life and forgives them ultimately and doesn't stand in judgment. There's no real malice involved. You come away ultimately uplifted and with a sense of genuine humanity about it all.
I agree. Yeah. I think like every great playwright, he's not forcing an opinion down your throat. He's putting human beings into challenging and comical situations that are morally ambiguous and essentially saying to you as an audience, okay, what would you do? How are you going to go about getting money? In this world, how are you going to go about advancement? How are you going to pay the bills? How are you going to get the woman that you love or the man that you love?
And how will you treat her?
And how will you treat her? Yeah. I think every great piece of drama essentially is like that. It's human beings put in situations where they're not saints and they're not devils, they're human beings, and they face choices that are difficult. And that's why as an audience, we keep coming back to the great plays, because we continue to struggle with these dilemmas.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think we've overrun our time anyway, and I know we could talk for hours on this play, as we already have. But Matt, I want to thank you so much for joining me. But first, before I let you go, one of the traditions of the podcast is that I like to ask my guests to recommend a play that we could talk about in a future episode. So I wonder if there's a personal favorite, something you've directed or acted in or want to direct that you'd be happy to suggest.
Well, Can I have a musical?
Yes, of course you can have a musical.
Okay. If I can have a musical, then the musical I would choose would be Stephen Sondheim and Lepine's Sunday in the Park with George.
Okay. Why?
It's just the most extraordinary work. I think it's his masterpiece, and that is up against a tremendous amount of competition. It's a brilliant, brilliant play about the nature of art and the challenge of personal relationships against really an obsessive artist. And it is just beautiful. The way Sondheim marries, as he always does, the form of his music against the content. It's got a terrific book. It is a beautiful, beautiful piece of work.
I love the idea of an obsessive artist. So we will definitely entertain the possibility of a musical.
Okay.
Thank you, Matt. Before we bring the curtain down, a brief plug, if I may. If you're listening to this podcast before the 25th or 26th of September, 2021, and live within, let's say, 100 miles of London, you're very welcome to come along to see our production of The Recruiting Officer this weekend. Search online the Teddington Theatre Club, and you can find links to buy tickets. Thanks very much. As the curtain falls on the new recruits, some to the army, some to wedlock, we celebrate their successes, empathize with their challenges, enjoy their wit, admire their tenacity, recognizing something of ourselves in their will to love and prosper. And finally, we join in cheering the cast for the sheer joy of the theatre and of life. Huzzah!
Huzzah!
Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Thanks for listening. To listen to other episodes, to find out news about future episodes, or to leave comments about what you've heard, please visit us at www.theplaypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at theplaypod. You're also welcome to email plays@theplaypodcast.com to suggest plays that we could talk about in future episodes. You can also register your suggestion on the website. Thanks again, and see you next time.